The focus here is on Jesus' authority. He forgives sins. They don't like that. He calls sinners who need deliverance. Just to let you in on a little secret, that's all of us. They don't like that either. He introduces new practices fit for the new kingdom. They hate that. Why do they hate that? Why do they hate that Jesus is introducing new practices for a new kingdom? Because they've got the old practices locked down, man. They know where they stand. They know how things work. They know the flow. But when Jesus comes in, he starts wrecking the flow. And they're like, whoa, I don't know how to do this. We need to get it back to the status quo quickly. We need this guy out of the way. Not only does he not follow, he brings in new ways of thinking about things, he critiques old traditions. Now, he doesn't critique the word. He critiques their traditions. Let me, for example, we're walking through the fields, picking grain, right? Now, there was Jewish law, or Jewish traditional law, that buffered the God-given law from Mount Sinai. They were so concerned about not breaking the letter of the law given by Moses that they built these buffer laws around the main law. So they had things like you can't walk more than a certain distance on the Sabbath. That would be considered work. And in fact, if you are aware, that's why a lot of synagogues, especially in our time, they don't have like parking lots because you'd never drive longer than it's always within walking distance of a certain distance. You can't walk or you can't drive or you can't go any farther than a certain, they're still doing it today. So there were these laws, these rules, these traditional things built around God's law that padded it, and I think originally their intent was good. You know, we don't want to break God's laws. We want to make sure that we don't even get close to them. I think for some purpose, that's a good thing. Think about it. We live in a culture that loves to ride that fence, right? I'm doing good, I'm doing bad. You know, we're sitting right on that thing. They're saying, no, we don't want to sit right on the law. We want to be over here. And in fact, as the years passed, they started getting over here and over here and over here. And then we get into the concept of religious legalism. Religious legalism that says if you don't live a certain way and culturally separate in such a way, then you are no longer a Christian or you're no longer Jewish. That's not. So Jesus is bringing it back. He's like, no, I was there when the law was written. I knew the intent. I knew the reason for it. Let's get back to kingdom principles. And you might be thinking, but Pastor, didn't we just talk about how you just did a whole series on how the Ten Commandments are the code for which civilization is built? Yes, we did. We did that. And they're all very good. But what is the purpose of those 10 commandments? You keeping them is not going to get you to heaven. But they're there for our benefit. They're there for our ability to thrive in this world. We also learned in that series that Jesus took those laws and expanded them to help us understand their original purpose and the context for which they were codified. So in the case of the Sabbath, let's just take the one Sabbath. These new kingdom policies mean that, like all other commands God has given, rest was meant to encourage the flourishing of humanity and all of creation. The rest was there to help the flourishing of not only us, but even the land. There were Sabbath years where they could not work the land because it needed some rest. Now, in modern times, we understand that as crop rotation. They didn't understand why. They did it because God said to do it, and then that year they just let the field go to seed, and then in that year, all the nutrients was brought back into the ground so that then when they used it the next year, oh, wow, it worked. Big surprise, right? So it was meant for that. In each of these stories, the Sabbath is broken. The Sabbath is broken for the purpose of human flourishing. The disciples get grain as they walk through the grain fields in 2:23. And Jesus heals a man in the synagogue. Whereas the Pharisees used the law as a means to gain power, the Pharisees used the law as a means to gain power and resented any threat to it, Jesus reveals the true intent of the law, which is this: to bring about human flourishing and restore the places where it has been broken. The law was given so that broken people living in a broken world could live a kingdom life. That's what it was given for. And we talked about that in the whole series, so we don't need to retread that ground. But what I'm trying to say here is that Jesus is saying, you are such hypocrites. You would actually tell me that I cannot restore a man's hand just because it's on Sunday. And there's an element of work to it. And he's like, you guys are such hypocrites. Doesn't the law say that if your donkey falls into a pit on the Sabbath, you don't leave it in the pit, you get it out? Is that not work? Yes, of course it is. You hypocrites. I think this is interesting. Now, I'm not a big fan of the New York Times, but this is interesting. Tony Schwartz authored a New York Times article entitled, "Relax, You'll Be More Productive." In that article, it details the current public health crisis of chronic lack of adequate sleep. I just hear a moan in the room. Our next guys' night is just going to set up some cots in there. Maybe ladies, maybe just set up some cots. And you think about the sleep issues that we have today. I mean, there's industries that have been built up around our lack of ability to get a good night's sleep, right? Mattresses that, can read your mind. Pills, teas, tricking apps that trick you to fall asleep. Ever see those? It's voodoo, don't do it. They're like mind control, sleep. It's a huge industry. But this Times article did something I think is very interesting, and it sheds a light on how we think about things. Ready? The most interesting part of the Times article concerned the marketing that the sleep industry most relies on. So the sleep industry is looking at statistics. They're trying to figure out what to do, and here's what they looked at. It reports on studies that measured the performance of baseball players with longer sleep schedules and the productivity of a daytime nap taker. So here's why you rest. This is why we understand. We rest. The only reason to get a good sleep is so that we can do more. We could be more. It's not just that rest is a good thing. It's not just like being rested is good for your body. It's not just, it's just that, these guys, they did better in baseball because they got better rest. So that's why you should rest. Or these people took naps in the day, so they were way more productive in their jobs and in their industries. The Bible talks about rest being just an inherent good. You should have time where you're not doing something. This idea that just being at rest is not enough, but it's only good if it allows us to do something better. It sees rest as not an inherent good, but as a means to a greater end, doing more. We sometimes respond to God's good gifts in the same way as the Pharisees, using them as tools for our own purposes instead of seeking the kind of flourishing they're intended to encourage. So the Pharisees used the laws of God, rather than them being an instrument for human flourishing, they use it to lock people down, to control them, to solidify their own power, and they couldn't handle it. They couldn't handle it when Jesus came around and started unraveling their control. They are so immediate to like, we got to kill this guy. That's how important control was to them. In a Christianity Today article entitled, "Who is the Sabbath for?" Amy Baker writes this: while the command to keep the Sabbath holy is not repeated in the New Testament, these stories draw us back into discovering the heart behind the initial command, which is really what Jesus is doing here. In Deuteronomy, the Israelites are commanded to rest on the seventh day as an act both of remembrance and of service to others. Here, the emphasis lies not upon God as creator, but on God as redeemer, as the one who brought the Israelites out of slavery. That's a key word. We talked about it last series. But this idea of rest is to remind us that we're not slaves. We're not slaves. In fact, we don't just sleep so that we can slave away better. We're not slaves. The Israelites must rest in order to allow their laborers to rest. He's saying, you guys at the top, you got to stop. Because if you don't stop, then the people who are under you can't stop, and the people who are under them can't stop. It has to start at the top. I mean, we used to live in a culture just 50 years ago or so where shops were closed on Sunday. Can you imagine that? I think it would be, I don't know what I would do. I mean, the world functioning like Chick-fil-A? I don't know. But like, think about it. You'd have to plan ahead now, wouldn't you? You'd have to plan ahead. But because those at the top have decided that they're not going to take a break, because taking a break would mean losing capital, although Chick-fil-A has proven that wrong, losing capital. That means that their employees, their managers can't take a break. That means that the employees and the sales floor and all, it trickles on down to the point where nobody's breaking and nobody's stopping and everybody's stressed out and haggard. You don't look haggard. You look great. I was in my office and somebody came in and was like, "You okay?" I'm like, "Yeah, why?" He's like, "You just look really tired." I'm like, "Oh, perfect sermon." Yeah. But that's what Israel, God commanded, not just so that they could remember, but if you don't, God's saying we all have to do this or no one's going to be able to do it. The Israelites must rest in order to allow their laborers to rest, in order to recognize the humanity, the God-given creatureliness of their fellow human beings. Whether or not these people share their faith, he said, even the strangers that are within your borders, they have to do this too. Okay, so whether they shared your faith or of high social status, are women or children, slave or free, everybody had to take a break. Why? So that they can be more productive the next day. No! Because it's good to take a break. We need it. Anyway, we kind of hammered on that last week, but I just want you to understand what Jesus is doing. He's bringing this back to the original purpose for it. It wasn't for control. It was for human flourishing in a broken world. So take the healing that Jesus did. He didn't just heal the man in the synagogue. He publicly restored a man who would have faced social obstacles due to his disability. You might recall a passage where Jesus and his disciples are walking by a blind man. And they asked Jesus the question, because this is what was pounded into their heads. Jesus, who sinned? Was it the man or his parents who sinned? And Jesus is like, "Oh my gosh, you guys are so thick." No, seriously, he gets exasperated with them. Same thing with this guy. His deformity would have been not only disabling to his productivity in the world, but it also casts a pallor over him of being a sinner. Because people who have this, God doesn't do this to good people. You must have had something in your life, or your parents did. So he was looked on as a pariah. So when Jesus does this, he changes not only this guy's ability to do, but he also changes the stigma that was attached to him. No, it wasn't because. And this also, you got to think of the way a Pharisee would. This also is essentially a forgiveness of sin. Because that's what caused this, right? So when you take that away, whoa, he forgives. Wow, they hate him. They hate him for it because they're losing the control that the law gave them because they were using it as they were bullies. They were bullies.